Hello, I'd like to welcome you again to Greek Reading Group with Ephesians. I'm Professor Fred Long, and I have some students here, and we're working through the Greek text of Ephesians. I'll use different Greek editions, sometimes the UBS text, Nestle-Aland text, sometimes the SBL Greek New Testament. I'm working inside of Logos Bible software, and I have applied a visual filter that you can look at, and it might help you with your exegesis. And right now, I've got the SBL GNT up, and we've stopped at verse 21. And so just to pick up, we're in chapter 1, and Paul is becoming more and more elaborative. And last time we looked at some of the information structure. What's happening in verse 20 is that he is explaining more about the power, particularly the energia, that is the manifestation of power, that the power that is operative. And he uses different power words in verse 19 that we can see here. And then he picks up on the energia. I know that because the ein, starting verse 20, that ein is feminine. And so it's going back to a feminine antecedent, which is energia. Energia. And so, and there's a little bit of a kind of an implied cognate accusative, because then he uses the verb energeken, which he has worked out in Christ. Now, what's so significant about this is there's actually a textual variant between SBL GNT and the recognized, the kind of eclectic text of the United Bible Societies, which is the same as Nestle-Aland text. So the editor, Holmes, has indicated that this should be perfect tense, energeken, which he has worked out. And if that's perfect tense there, that would imply a more of a stress on the resultant effect. Now, the UBS text doesn't recognize this as a variant, not a significant enough variant, so it doesn't have anything there to indicate that there's a variant right here. But if we go to Nestle-Aland, the 28th edition, we actually will see that there's a sigla there that alerts us that there's a textual referent. So we can see that support for this perfect tense form comes in the form of Codex Alexandrinus and Vaticanus, as well as Minuscule 81, as opposed to the text as is found in the UBS Nestle-Aland is supported by Sinaiticus, and then some the Western text of D, F, and G, etc. So really kind of a important variant here that this, if this is perfect tense, I think it's fitting with the emphasis that's being stressed here. So some exegetical significance there. If it's a perfect tense, it's obviously stressing the resultant state of this manifestation of God's power in Christ, manifested in Christ. And then we saw last time that these two participles that follow are explaining more about this manifest power that God has, this energetic power, this working, this inner working that is manifest, that this is seen in two ways. First of all, raising him from the dead. If you have the sympathetic highlighting turned on, if that starts to work, we should be able to see that this raising him from the dead is found right here. And then sitting him at the right hand in the heavenly realms. Okay. So then 21, we have a prepositional phrase that begins, that is spatial, indicating where is he seated in the heavenly realms, or in what regard, in relation to what is he seated. So 21, we have upar anno pases arches ke exousias ke dunameos ke kuriotetos ke pantos onamatos onamads omenu ou monon en to eoni tuto ala ke en to melonti. So we have a list of entities or positions, and I think here these are more positions, places, and I believe that it's meant to be comprehensive. Every rule, so this passes here, I'm going to switch to the UBS text because I have a filter on that indicates modifiers or words having to do with quantity. And this helps alert me to usually some ideological push on the part of an author, or some kind of stress or prominence. When an author specifies quantity, there's usually some reason for that. You know, like the 12 tribes, obviously the number 12 becomes significant. So 12 apostles becomes important. Words like all or every, much or great, these kinds of words, sometimes words indicating specific entities, you know, single things or one things. We're going to see that. Here what's being stressed is the allness, the inclusive scope of what is over which what Christ is over. Far above. He's far above. And this is quite a flourish here. And then the all is repeated. And it may be repeated because these other nouns are feminine, but then this one switches to neuter. So that's kind of interesting. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes, you know, one all might capture, you know, a variety. But here it's reset to agree, and may, in a certain sense, kind of set this one apart in terms of it being maybe any possible name. So whatever position, title, name, whatever, doesn't matter, whatever. So it really gets inclusive at this point, whatever name being named. And there's obviously a redundancy there. I don't think this participle is necessary. This would be probably an adjectival participle. And it doesn't have the article because its head noun doesn't have the article. So every name which is being named. It's not an adjective, adverbial or circumstantial, like while or as or if being named. I don't think that's really the point. It's anarthrous without the article because its head noun is anarthrous, and so adjectival participles will agree with their typically with the specificity of their head noun. So every name that is being named. And there seems to be a redundancy here. You don't need that strictly. He could have just said every name, period. But every name being named might suggest it might make it a little bit more vivid that there are entities that are naming other entities, or giving name, privilege and name to other things. And if that's not clear enough, that every name being named is Christ is far above it, he then adds this u Allah construction, or uk Allah construction, which just is like the final icing on the cake. So not only in this age, but in the coming age also. A lot of correlative emphasis is how I've described this. So the Allah is a kind of a setup. It's a way to stress a contrast. And here the monon ramps that up, and then the ke corresponds with that, meaning also. So not only, but also. And in a sense, what's achieved by this is even more comprehensive scope across time. So that Christ is in this position not only now, but in the coming age, whatever that age may be. Now this came up in exegesis class last week, is what age is this that's coming? Because later, like in 2:7, Paul will talk about that there's going to be a grace for us in the ages to come. In the ages to come. So, is there one age that's about to come, or are there multiple ages? And what might that mean? That's a fair question to ask. Paul's language is specific. So is this coming age, some other separate age, or is this simply singular to go with, to kind of be the counterpart to this age, and in really any age that might be coming? But Paul doesn't word it that way. He says in the coming age. Interesting to note this. So Christ has a position far above every rule of power, not only in this age, but also in the coming age. And then in verse 22, we have a ke. So at this point, we could understand this ke in two different ways. We could understand it as the continued work of God He works, this power was manifest, which he manifested in Christ. So which power, and he submitted everything under his feet. I don't believe that really works. I don't think that this ke is linking back to en ergeisen. I think that this ke is almost resetting the discourse in terms of a main sentence. So what this would suggest is that there probably should be a period. If I'm right with this, there should be a period here, because he's not continuing this relative pronoun clause. It'd actually be kind of hard to understand how he's continuing this relative pronoun clause, because the grammar doesn't work with that. So just imagine this which being right here, which also he submitted all things under his feet. See, that doesn't really work. So I don't think this is continuing in the subordinate clause. So rather, I think this is a reset, building on, adding to what he just affirmed, but in a new, in a sentence. It's not marked as a new development. It is marked continuity. That's what the ke is marking, but I think it's moving on with a distinct grammar point here with these finite verb forms. He submitted or subordinated all things under his feet and gave him headship over all things in the church. So what I'm suggesting here is then, why is the de not used? So what would a de signal that ke doesn't? So de would indicate a distinctive move. Ke does not mark that. It's marking that this is in addition to. It's expressing some continuity in terms of adding something. So this is not a distinctive new point, but rather something that is in some continuity with what's just been said. And so we're left to think what that might be. But if you think about it, what's just been affirmed in 20 and 21 is that Christ has been raised and set into this ruling position. And a part of what that entails is what's being explained in verse 22. Everything has been subordinated. So this isn't a distinct, separate point. This is a continued explanation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is it okay to take that K in verse 22 as ascensive, even submitting everything under his feet and making him the head over all things?
Yeah, so the question is could this be an ascensive use of ke, marking thematic addition, meaning like also or even? I'm trying to think through the grammar here, going back to which power he exercised in Christ. Even submitting, even subordinating all things. See, that could work if this were a participle, but it's not. It's a finite verb form. Even or also he submitted all things under him. At that point, this is just simply the equivalent of and he submitted, also he submitted all things to his feet. And that's why ke can mean both, is that they're very similar, but in terms of the grammar here, it's just adding this finite verb affirmation to the resurrection and ascension, which has just been affirmed, what God has worked out in terms of raising and seating him at the right hand. And then this is being added to that he subordinated all things under his feet. And, see, then you get another and. See, what's happening is that you're getting these ke as adding more information to what's already been affirmed about his being raised and seated, and then he subordinated and he gave him as head. So that's what's being affirmed then in 22, is these kes are marking additions to the material that's just been presented in terms of him being raised up and seated in the heavenly realm. Yeah, so in Paul's mind, so in terms of the information structure, he's not setting these forth as distinct new informations, but rather as information that belongs together. That's what's so interesting, is that this move to manifest God's power by raising him and seating him in the right hand, that information, to that information is being added both the subordination, the fact that God has subordinated all things, again, inclusive scope, put all things in subjection under his feet, and he's giving him to be head. He's given him to be head for over all things for the church. There's kind of a nice organic imagery that's emerging here. So in verse 22, you've got head, body. You got head, feet, and body. and 23. So you have this organic entity being described, and really begins in verse 20, where you have his right hand at the right side. So this is very spatial, very positional. And in his right there is an idiom for meaning like right side, right hand. So the word hand is understood. So it's really literally in his right. And then the hand is understood. So you have hand, feet, head, and body. So you have this organic image of Jesus in relationship to the church, his body. This is a political metaphor. So when Paul talks about different body parts in 1 Corinthians 12, he's deploying a political metaphor. So this is well established in Margaret Mitchell's book on the rhetoric of reconciliation. And you can read her description of how this is fitting a political discourse. Lots been written on it. So here Paul is deploying this organic imagery. As I've probably already mentioned, Seneca writing to the young Emperor Nero and De Clementia, the piece on mercy or on clemency, describes the Emperor Nero as the soul or head of the Roman people, which is his body. And it's on this basis that he should show mercy, clemency towards its members. And so this is not Gnostic language. This is not, head, weird kind of body language of the end of the 1st century or 2nd century. This is really political discourse language that's concurrent in the mid-1st century A.D.
So it means that in ancient Roman they show mercy. How about Paul used this political image to describe the domination of Lord, or to show the mercy of God?
Well, I think, he's showing really the dominance of Jesus, the fact that he's been put into the highest position. Now, why that's so important is because we ought to align our lives with that reality. And so, as we're going to find out, we're going to learn more about Christ, his character, his nature, his virtue, his self-sacrificial love. And that if God is affirming Jesus in that, precisely in that mode of giving his life as a ransom for many, so to speak, what does that mean for us in our discipleship? We're supposed to follow Jesus, be like him. He's gonna eventually get to this discourse in chapter 4, which is just really focusing on our unity of faithfulness, looking at Jesus. And this is what we're to grow in our unity as followers of Jesus, is to look to him as our model, really our measure. And he uses the Greek word metron there. He is the measure of maturity for us. What does it mean to be a mature human being? We just have to think of how powerful this is in the 1st century context, where everyone is looking for the God's manifest power. They're looking at political rulers. They understood that this was the ideology. We are in places of rule because God has so ordained it. And you better line up under us or behind us, or else you're in our way. You're in the God's way. You're not acknowledging the God's work. And so people in privileged ruling positions were given great honor, respect, courtesy, and they had influence, and people would look to them and try to imitate them. And this was happening in cities. That's why cities, wealthy people were rivals with one another, trying to honor the emperor. And actually this came at a great benefit to them, because they could start receiving benefactions from the emperor. And then the emperor would receive their benefactions of thanks and praise and honor and cult. So there's this huge cycle of patron-client, and it just kind of went on and on and on. Jesus precisely confronts this. He says, don't be like the Gentile kings who like to lord it over their people. They like to be called benefactors. Don't be like that. That's not what it means to be my follower. Come follow me instead. And so Jesus shows a different model of humble servanthood that extends friendship to one's enemies, feeds the hungry, helps the poor, identifies with those who are outcast. And so it's a different model. Right now, however, Paul is saying, this is where God has placed Jesus. He's placed him way up here, above all these other claims of rule. And this is for the sake of the church. And that's what he's saying here. This is for the benefit of the church. He gave him to be head over all things. And then you have a dative here, for the church. That's a real good dative of advantage. He gave him to be head for the church. And just one kind of grammatical point here. He gave him, and I've been sneaking in the infinitive, to be head. So he gave him to be head. This is called a double accusative construction. And with a double accusative, it's often helpful. I described this in my Koenig Greek grammar. There's different ways to classify double accusatives. I think the one way that I learned from my classical professor, it's, I think, the most helpful way, is that one of these is internal and one of these is external. In other words, one starts outside the action of the verb. When you add the action of the verb, it's affected and becomes something. And so it's often helpful to think which one was there, and then the verb acts on it, and then it's transformed or transferred. It goes through the action of the verb. So which entity here? You get a pronoun and a noun. Which one is external? Which one is internal? That is, goes through the inner workings of the verb and is more intricately connected to the verbal action. That's called the internal one. So which one starts external? Which one is internal? He gave him to be head.
Give is internal.
Well, give is the verb. So which of these nouns, head or him?
Avton would be external.
Yeah, the avton, him, he was there, and God, through the process of making and giving him, makes him to be head. So the head is the internal that is really affected by the verb. So God took Jesus and made him, gave him to be head over all things for the church. And really this is, we're really looking at God's benefaction. He gave Jesus, the suffering Messiah, to be our political head. That's his that's God's benefaction to us. Jesus is God's co-regent. So
internal is the key, yeah. It's kind of the
internal is the object. When you have a double accusative, a double object, it's the one that is kind of comes out the other end of the verb. And some verbs are more obvious. This one is a little bit more difficult, but avton is the one that is external, and through the action of the verb, we receive him as the head. He's given as head. So God gave him to be head over all things, uper with the accusative, over, for the benefit, for the sake of the church. He gave it to the church. We're the recipients and beneficiaries of this headship. Yeah.
So I had a question. The first one is about the authority, the right hand. Do we have any outside text that shows what makes this author or Paul push for this? Because it seems like there's a pretext or a subtext that prompts him to write this. Do we find something in the environment? Do we find something later in the text? Something like that.
So something that why Paul would be writing this?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's thinking of the coronation psalm. He's thinking of probably Psalm 110. The Lord said, "My Lord, come sit at my right hand until I make your enemies footstool under your feet."
Yeah,
so this is Psalm 110.
Ephesians itself.
Oh.
Where this letter went. What is it that might have prompted? Because we don't have any letter or something like that. I'm trying to figure out if we find any kind of like any subtext in the background
Yeah, all I can say is that Ephesus there's an active imperial cult presence there. It's also a place of magic and power. So Clinton Arnold has looked at that background, but it's also a very powerful imperial place. And if this is a circular letter, which I think it was, because in Ephesus isn't in our earliest manuscripts, right? Although the heading is to the Ephesians, but then there's no place where it's written. So I think it's meant to be a circular letter, in which case then there's just a lot of Roman presence here and power display in general.
Asia Minor
So-
was particularly obsessed with the imperial cult.
Yeah, Asia Minor, that's right, is obsessed with the imperial cult. So if this is a circular letter, it makes perfectly good sense. So I can read it against both backgrounds, although I am persuaded that the imagery is pervasively political, and we haven't seen that. We've seen it as Gnostic, or we've not understood it. This is highly political discourse, and these are positions of political power. I'm not trying to discount spiritual aspects of this. There are spiritual forces, but I do want to recognize what the language seems to be predominantly about. So I think this is part of the imperial ideology, is that the emperors, when they die, they became gods and are seated among the heavenly places. So I could point you to artifacts that show that. Literally, Augustus sitting next to Roma, the personification of the Roman people, so that if you look at the Gemma Augustea, you can see that. The heavenly realms, earthly realms below. So this language, I think, is countering that imperial narrative.
It's very strongly cultic and
Yeah,
political. That's what I was asking about.
it is very cultic. And Paul, we're going to get to chapter 4 eventually, but there he affirms 7 different ones. One God and Father, one Lord, one Spirit. But in addition to that, he mentions one faith, one hope. Well, there were cults to hope and faith. And then he mentions one baptism. And then one body. And of course, Roma, there's a cult of Roma, so one body. And one baptism. Now, it's interesting that, I'm anticipating a discussion, I'll just quickly say, is that you can develop cults around places where you experience the divine. And baptism is where we're converted. We're experiencing the divine. So anyway, these lists of 7 ones is so interesting when we get there, because these are Trinitarian, but then you have these 4 other things added. It's like, what is Paul? These are like rallying points. It's almost like a creed, and it's almost somewhat cultic in a sense, in the best sense of the word cult, like that which we recognize where God is present, things that we're committed to, and baptism is one of them, and it's where we encounter the Spirit and conversion. So yeah, there's Paul is trying. In the end, what's happening is that Paul is wanting believers to be secured in their faith and their allegiance, religiously, politically, socially. And that the major counterparts in Asia Minor, Ephesus, is paganism and imperial cult. And all kinds of other deities, entities, rulers that are rivaling Christ and God's actions in Christ. And he's trying to say Christ is above them all. He is saying that. He's not trying. He is saying it. Now, it's a grand vision of what the church is, the assembly of God's people. Now, he's going to end chapter 1 with a further explanation. Aetis. This is an indefinite relative pronoun. It's going back to the church, and it's completing this body metaphor. We've had a right hand, we've had a foot, we've had a head, and the only thing missing is the body. And the body is the church, and he defines it. The church, which is his body. We're organically connected to Christ. Metaphysically connected, organically connected. And again, this is a political metaphor. He's going to talk about this again in chapter 4, affirm once again that Christ is our head. And he's even going to describe us as like members of one another, and like we're ligamented together and connected, and we're growing. Now, Cicero, when he's talking about the Republic of Rome, talks about it maturing and being organic. Paul talks about that as well, right there in chapter 4, maturing and growing. And so this is a common metaphor, not only the body parts, but also that we're going to be growing. Very powerful. Now the last, yeah.
So I want to ask a grammatical question.
Sure.
So the dative ecclesia, you take it as advantage.
Well, it's really recipient, but we see it. We see that this is a benefit also rendered to the church.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask if, because the church is the body and Christ is the head for the body, what would people mean if that was to be taken as the sphere, when you said Christ is the head in the body? Would that limit how, to the extent of the power that the physicians might view the lordship of Christ? Would that have any impact on it?
No, because the head was often seen as the originating part and the controlling part for the body. So it's not that wouldn't be a subordination of Christ. It would actually show Christ as like origin and with authority over. That's why it was used in a political way, and often this language was used to argue for the predominance of the ruling class at the expense of everyone else. But Paul subverts that in 1 Corinthians 12. And as he's going to explain here, that Christ loves us and gives himself for us as an example. So in a sense, he's subverting this model as well because of the kind of leader and Lord that Jesus is. This church is his body. The fullness, I think, rather the fulfillment. And it's just, you have to look up the word, and you can see that it can mean fullness or fulfillment, that which fills up, but that which is a complement completes, that which is full of something, that which is brought to fullness or completion, act of fulfilling or fulfillment. This is within the realm of this word's meaning, is fulfillment. And the reason I would suggest that is, earlier there was a reference in 1:10 that Christ oversees the fullness of the times. And I would suggest, it's translated as fullness of the time, but I think it just makes more sense as fulfillment of the times. This was a particular moment in Jewish eschatological expectation or understanding that the Gentiles would have their way over the Jews. It was not a good time. It shows up in Romans, it shows up in Luke, and Paul is saying that God has set Jesus over the administration of this fulfillment of the times. We're in eschatological time now. The body of Gentiles coming into God's people is a fulfillment of God's plans. It is an era that we're in. And it's an era of mission right now. God has given him authority over all things in heaven and earth. That's Matthew 28. Go make disciples of all nations. Okay, so Luke 21, Jesus talks about there's going to be trampling over Jerusalem until the fulfillment of the Gentiles. The times are fulfilled. I think we're still in that time. And so Paul here is affirming that the church, the assembled body, the assembly, and I like to translate it as assembly because church has too many, we associate modern day concepts with it. We need to kind of go back to a political, it's a kind of a politically organized entity, that this is his body, and then we have apposition to this body. That's apposition. The fulfillment. And then we have a substantive participle, to pleromenu. The one, and here there's debate, is this a middle? Is this a passive? In form, it could be middle or passive. And so we're left wondering what that might mean. I think it's middle. I think it's middle, and I think it's referring to God, or perhaps to Christ. Who is the actor here? Whose body is it? Well, in the end, it's God and Christ. Okay, so the one who, with the middle voice, is fulfilling all things in every way. So the church is God's plan A. It's His fulfillment of prophetic expectations, and there's a fulfillment of the Abrahamic blessing to the nations that is occurring right now. This is the fulfillment. It's not a surprise. It's a mystery, which is a secret, which is revealed. So the word mystery really is a secret that is made known. And he's going to talk about what this mystery is. It is the body of believers made up of believing Jews and believing Gentiles. And this is the fulfillment of the one who's fulfilling all things. So the reason why it's middle, it just means that the actor has involvement in the action. That's all. It's just kind of stressing this. So how is God engaged and active and involved in the action? Well, I mean, He's obviously present in the Spirit. He's present in sending us Jesus as an example for us, and the one to whom we're supposed to grow to be mature people. And then He gives us the Spirit. So it's simply just saying that God is invested in this mission. Of course He is. He's fulfilling, and then we have this sandwich around all things in every way, or in all things. Fulfilling everything in every way. And I think fulfilling all things would be the prophetic expectations, and in every way would be kind of manner. And we know that God works in all kinds of circumstances, in every kind of way. Now, if we take that as like He fills all things, I think that's a harder concept to understand. How is He filling all things? Like, He already is everywhere present. So we'd have to kind of go with some kind of restricted understanding of filling all things. How does He fill all things?
Sound like some kind of form of pantheism or something.
Yeah. Well, and Gnosticism, and that's how they read this text, as if He's like needing to fill something that He isn't already present. So I don't think that that's what's going on. I think it's fulfillment of Scriptures, fulfillment of God's plan.
So if the church is there, if the church, according to Paul here, is the fulfillment of God Himself, how does this align with Romans 9:11 and 12? Romans 9:11, where you're having Him talking about the church, Israel, and all of that. I can see that, but I'm wrestling with maybe dispensational theology here, more of where you have this kind of like bipartite view of the age of salvation. So I'm seeing all of
Yeah, it's a huge question. I've got a lengthy paper I presented. I haven't published it yet. I need to get it published. It was well received. I laid out lots of evidence. I found lots of evidence that this, again, I would say that, you know, a hardening on a portion of Israel has occurred until the fulfillment. Again, it's not, you know, fullness. Okay, complement. I can maybe understand that. The fulfillment of the Gentiles has come into it. Is erkome. Well, what did they come into? That's the question. And in my paper, I argue they're coming into Israel. And Israel is God's entity to define. Israel is according to promise. Israel is made up of believing Jews and believing Gentiles. He's argued that Israel is a fig tree? Or no, an olive tree. And he talked about branches being broken off. and branches being grafted in. Well, what are they being grafted into?
I like to read that paper.
They're being grafted into this olive branch. So
But
it's,
in Romans chapter 9, 6, Paul also mentioned that there are the two Israel, but actually is not the different Israel. The new Israel is kind of the not equal.
yeah, see, I don't think there are two Israels.
Yeah, but
I think there are kinsmen according to the flesh, and then there's the Israel of God.
That kind of goes in with his whole rhetoric concerning how God chooses one line to carry on the promise, and he goes back to Jacob and Esau.
Yeah, this is a big question. We'll have to talk about it some of the time, but it's a big and particularly a way to it's hard to discuss it in a minute or two at the end of a video. It'll come up again because Paul talks about what is this mystery, and it's Jew, Gentiles together into one body. So that's why there can't be two Israels. There's one.
yes, one.
There's
What kind
one.
of one?
What kind of one? It's the one that God sets up
Is it-
in his Messiah King, one that believes and trusts.
Is it totally new organic one or just
No, it's a continuation. I think it's a continuation because that's what Paul argues in Romans 11, right? Is that there's one branch, there's one olive tree from the patriarchs. So that's the same one. And so then branches are cut off or grafted in.
But it will kind of lead another option. It kind of means that Israel always at the same salvation. Israel always had the privileged position, so the Gentile just
No.
draw into.
No.
Well, we just belong to part of the
No. See, there's no. So that's how it ends. In chapter 11, it ends that God has consigned all people to disobedience that he might have mercy on them all. He's even the playing field. That's the thing, is even the playing field. No one person is more beloved than anyone else. No one is more sinful than anyone else. Like, we're all need to trust in Jesus and God's salvation. We can't rely on heredity. We can't rely on our works of any kind, pagan or other. It is all a matter of faith and trust in what God has accomplished.
Back to Ephesians, just you mentioned the time fulfillment. But I think is it any possible because Paul just talked about the God, the dominant of the spatial, but at the same time he also talked about the temple is a time spacious. It's a kind of time, and this is time. Is a space on both sides. So this is why he used fulfill, because maybe it's linked to the fulfillment, but also linked to the quantity about time.
Well, yeah, there is a time dimension. He keeps mentioning ages.
Yeah.
He does.
Yeah.
And that's what we debate about, is what's going to happen when.
Yeah.
But it sounds like we may agree. It's just a matter of how do we define these terms? How does Paul define them?
Yeah.
But I don't see him giving up on the language of Israel. I don't see that. I see that he retains that language. And I think he would say this is God's language. This is God's language. This is conversion. Jacob to Israel.
Yeah.
It's a matter of trusting in God, and it always has been.
Because when I think the last assignment, they kind of talk about Israel. One the scholar, I forgot his name. He kind of talk about he want to emphasize the equality of the Gentile and the Jews in front of the Israel. So this is why he think even we retain the same title, Israel, but didn't mean the Israel is that Israel. Yeah, I think, maybe this is because Paul used this name, but he re-implemented, like you said, organic or something. Because if organic means kind of the quality change for.
Yeah. Well, I guess people can use the word how they want.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to understand what Paul's saying when he's using it.
Okay.
If other people want to keep using it,
yeah, I don't know.
obviously they can. It's a very important topic and difficult.
Yeah.
Very
Thank you
good.
so
We'll see you
much.
next time.